By the time the first Roman sword clashed against a Carthaginian shield, the Battle of the Trebia was already over. It was not decided by tactics, formations, or the quality of steel. It was decided hours earlier, in the freezing dark, by empty stomachs, wet clothes, and a river swollen with winter rain. This is the story of how one of the greatest military minds in history wiped out an entire Roman army. Not by overpowering them, but by turning their own bodies and their own unyielding arrogance against them. It is December, in the year 218 BC. In northern Italy, the landscape is locked in a bitter, paralyzing winter. Before the sun has even risen, 40,000 Roman soldiers are ordered out of their camps into the freezing dark. They have not eaten. The metal of their armor saps the residual heat from their bodies. Ahead of them lies the Trebia River, a torrent of icy, rushing water. They are about to willingly wade straight into the deadliest dawn in Roman history. They are the finest heavy infantry in the ancient world, representing an empire that does not know how to yield. Yet, they are marching into an execution. To understand how 40,000 men could be so thoroughly dismantled, you have to look away from the morning mist and look at what happened in the dark the night before. The trap did not begin with weapons. It began with the systematic destruction of Roman security. Just weeks earlier, the Roman Senate believed this war would be fought and finished overseas. They believed the Alps were an impenetrable wall, but Hannibal had crossed those mountains. He was not just in Italy, he was breaking the alliances that held Roman power together. Under the cover of darkness, 2,200 Gallic soldiers, counted as loyal allies to Rome, rose in the night. They turned their blades on the Roman men sleeping beside them. Before dawn, these Gauls crossed the Trebia in the dark and reached the Carthaginian camp, offering Hannibal the severed heads of the Romans they had killed. It was a brutal, physical signal that the loyalty of the land was shifting. Hannibal did not just welcome them. He sent them back to their tribes to spread the word of their rebellion and bring him more men. He was winning the country one massacre at a time. Rome's response was massive, but fractured. Two consular armies were joined into one of the largest forces Rome had ever fielded. Yet they were led by two commanders who could not agree on how to survive. Consul Publius Scipio, wounded in a previous cavalry skirmish at the Ticinus River, understood the enemy. He saw that Hannibal was far from home. His supply lines were dangerously thin, and the brutal winter was closing in. Scipio's strategy was simple. Wait, outlast the invader. Let the freezing weather and starvation do the work of the legions. But the other commander, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, possessed a different kind of pressure. His year as consul was ending in a matter of weeks. A new man would soon ride up from Rome to replace him. And if he waited, his patience would become a stranger's triumph. Sempronius did not march his army through the winter to sit in the cold. He needed a victory, and he needed it now. Hannibal read this political desperation perfectly. He knew that a commander looking for glory stops being careful. So, Hannibal fed him. He sent raiders across the river to burn Gallic villages, punishing tribes he suspected of bargaining with Rome. The terrified villagers begged the Romans for protection. Sempronius gave it to them, sending his forces out to drive the Carthaginian raiders back. It was a small, cheap victory, but it achieved exactly what Hannibal intended. The Romans counted it as a win. Their confidence swelled. Sempronius believed he had the upper hand, completely blind to the fact that Hannibal had just handed him a controlled success on a day he chose, simply to ensure the Roman consul would be reckless on the day that actually mattered. While the Roman camp celebrated their minor triumph, another disaster quietly unfolded. A Roman supply town, Clastidium, held a massive depot of grain. Hannibal desperately needed it, but he did not want to lose men in a siege. Instead, he offered the garrison commander a simple choice. Open the gates and leave a rich man, or starve behind the walls until the city was taken by force. For a bribe of gold, the commander handed over the food his own side could not spare. In a single, bloodless stroke, the Carthaginian army was heavily fed, and the Romans were left with tightening rations. That night, as the Roman camp slept, Hannibal set the final, invisible piece of his machine. South of the open ground where the battle would be fought, there was a dry watercourse. Its banks were steep, heavily overgrown, with thick winter brush, just deep enough to hide men lying completely flat. Hannibal called for his younger brother, Mago. He ordered him to select 1,000 horsemen and 1,000 foot soldiers, the absolute best in the army. Under the cover of total darkness, Mago led these 2,000 picked men south and vanished into the ravine. Their orders were agonizingly simple. Lie in the freezing mud, wait for the entire Roman army to march past them, and do not move until the enemy is fully committed to the front. The Romans slept through the entire maneuver, entirely unaware that the jaws of the trap were already locked behind them. When the first light of dawn finally cracked over the horizon, Hannibal set the trap in motion. He sent his light Numidian cavalry across the river, not to wage a battle, but to provoke one. Their orders were exact. They rode straight up to the Roman palisades, hurling javelins into the camp, killing the sentries and enraging the legions. The Roman camp erupted into chaos. Horns blew. Centurions screamed for armor. Sempronius, fresh off his illusion of victory the day before, saw the enemy at his gates and reacted exactly as Hannibal knew he would. He did not pause to form a proper line. He did not wait for the men to eat their morning rations. He threw out all 4,000 of his cavalry to chase the Numidians, followed by 6,000 light infantry skirmishers, and then marched out the entire weight of his heavy legions. 40,000 men marched out into the freezing dawn on completely empty stomachs. Meanwhile, across the river, Hannibal's men were awake. They had eaten hot meals by warm fires. They had covered their bodies in oil to insulate themselves against the bitter cold. They moved to the field slowly, conserving every ounce of their energy, waiting for the Romans to come to them. The Numidian cavalry performed their role with lethal perfection. They fell back toward the river, never quite letting the Roman cavalry catch them, but never riding fast enough to let the Romans stop chasing. They pulled the entire Roman army toward the banks of the Trebia. It had been raining heavily, and the river was swollen, the water rushing fast and brutally cold. The Romans, driven by the furious momentum of their commander, did not stop at the water's edge. They plunged in. Tens of thousands of men waded into the current. The freezing water rose to their waists, then to their chests. The physical toll was immediate and devastating. The human body, when plunged into freezing water without fuel to burn, begins to shut down. Blood rushes away from the extremities to protect the vital organs. Muscles lock, hands go numb. By the time the Roman heavy infantry dragged themselves out of the water onto the far bank, they were soaked to the bone, shivering violently and starving. They were exhausted before they had swung a single sword. On the far side of the river, the two armies finally formed up. Sempronius deployed his men in the standard, terrifying Roman fashion. His light skirmishers, the velites, stood in front. Behind them, his veteran legions were massed in an unstoppable, dense center. The Allied and Gallic infantry protected the sides, and his cavalry was split on both wings. Even cold, soaked, and hungry, it was still a force of 40,000 men, the most dangerous heavy infantry on the face of the earth. Hannibal stretched a thin, deeply calculated line to meet them. He placed his Gallic infantry in the center, the exact point where the Romans were strongest. He flanked them with his tougher, battle-hardened Spanish and Libyan infantry. In front of his wings, he positioned his war elephants, massive beasts of terror, and wide on the far flanks, he placed his heavier, more numerous cavalry. The battle began with the skirmishers, and immediately, the morning's invisible preparations paid off. The Roman velites relied on javelins, but the rain and the river had ruined the leather-throwing straps of their weapons. More importantly, they had already exhausted most of their ammunition chasing the Numidians at dawn. When they closed the distance, they found their weapons useless beyond 30 meters. In stark contrast, Hannibal's Balearic slingers had not thrown a single stone. From 120 meters away, they unleashed a devastating hail of heavy lead and stone into the exhausted Roman light troops, shattering their lines and forcing them to fall back through the ranks of their own heavy infantry. With the skirmishers cleared, the main lines collided. 36,000 Roman and Allied soldiers surged forward, their massive shields locked, their short swords drawn. They slammed into the Carthaginian center with the force of a tidal wave. The slaughter was immense. The Roman veterans fought magnificently, grinding forward, hacking brutally into Hannibal's Gauls. The Carthaginian center buckled, giving ground under the immense pressure of the Roman push. The Romans roared, believing they were breaking the enemy line. They believed they were winning. They were not. They were falling into the deepest part of the trap. Hannibal had put his weakest troops in the center on purpose. He knew the Romans would push forward, and he needed them to. He designed his center to bend, to absorb the Roman momentum, drawing the heavy legions deeper and deeper into a pocket. While the Romans exhausted their remaining strength pushing forward, Hannibal's wings went to work. On the flanks, the cavalry clashed. Hannibal's Numidians and heavy horse slammed into the Roman riders. The Roman cavalry, already freezing and outnumbered, was wildly outmatched. Then, the true nightmare emerged from the Carthaginian lines. Hannibal's war elephants lumbered forward. The Roman horses, terrified by the sheer size, the unnatural movement, and the pungent smell of the beasts, panicked. They bucked, broke formation, and threw their riders into the freezing mud. The Roman velites desperately rushed the beasts, hurling their last remaining javelins and drawing blades to slash at the thick legs of the animals. Several elephants went down, screaming in the cold air, and for a fleeting moment, the Roman flanks tried to hold. But Hannibal knew exactly when to apply the final pressure. He ordered his heavy cavalry to clear the flanks entirely. The sheer weight and numbers of the Carthaginian horsemen overwhelmed the Roman cavalry, sweeping them completely off the battlefield. Suddenly, the flanks of the Roman infantry army were stripped bare. The protective sides of their massive formation vanished. And then, the small things from the night before came due. The Romans, having crossed the freezing river, could no longer feel their hands. They could barely grip their heavy shields or swing their swords. Hannibal's men, dry, fed, and warm, pressed in from the sides. The Carthaginian, Spanish, and Libyan veterans collapsed inward, hitting the exposed Roman flanks with devastating force. As the Roman line compressed, struggling to fight on three fronts, the final blow was struck. Deep in the brush of the dry watercourse behind them, Mago's 2,000 picked men rose from the mud. They erupted from the ravine at a dead run and slammed directly into the unprotected rear of the Roman army. This was the exact moment the battle ceased to be a contest and became an execution. The Romans were now surrounded. They were struck from the front, crushed on both flanks, and butchered from the rear at the exact same time. The noise of the slaughter drowned out any hope of command. Orders stopped reaching the line. The freezing men, trapped in a tightening circle of spears, fought for their lives as their unit cohesion shattered into absolute panic. And yet, at the very center of the nightmare, something extraordinary occurred. The veteran Roman legions, the men who had been grinding forward against the Gauls, refused to break. Even as their allied cavalry fled, even as their flanks dissolved, and even as the army died screaming around them, these men relied on sheer mechanical discipline. 10,000 Roman heavy infantrymen closed their ranks, locked their shields, and punched straight through the Carthaginian center. They did not rout. They did not scatter into the wilderness. They marched out of the slaughter, a single, bloody block of iron, and walked all the way to the town of Placentia. It was a staggering display of infantry power, but it was the only piece of the Roman army that survived. Everyone else paid the price. Ancient sources vary, but as many as 28,000 Romans were killed, heavily wounded, or taken prisoner on the banks of the Trebia. Hannibal's losses were only a fraction of that, falling almost entirely on the Gauls he had intentionally sacrificed in his center. In a matter of weeks, operating completely alone, with no supply line and no road back to his homeland, Hannibal had beaten both Roman consuls on Roman soil. He had left absolutely nothing to chance. He had controlled the time, the terrain, the temperature, and the psychology of his enemy. But the victory demanded a terrible physical toll from the victors as well. In the freezing, miserable weeks that followed the battle, the brutal weather punished the Carthaginians. Nearly all of Hannibal's massive war elephants, suffering from their battle wounds and the unforgiving winter cold, died in the snow. By the time spring finally arrived, only one elephant was left alive. When the news of the massacre reached Rome, it arrived like a physical wound to the entire republic. 40,000 men had marched out. A fraction had returned. A sitting consul had been humiliated in the field. The Senate was paralyzed by the scale of the disaster. How does an empire lose an entire army to a single man? But rather than face the terrifying reality of Hannibal's genius, the Roman official record chose the comfort of denial. They blamed the river. They blamed the winter rain. They blamed the unexpected cold that destroyed their formations. They blamed Sempronius's haste and his reckless desire for glory. They blamed the Gallic betrayal. They blamed absolutely everything except the man standing across the water. They refused to admit that their unyielding Roman strength was exactly what Hannibal had used to destroy them. That refusal to understand their enemy would cost them dearly. Because Hannibal was not finished. Within months, as the weather warmed, he would not wait for Rome to march out to meet him again. At a place called Lake Trasimene, he would vanish into the morning fog, using the landscape to swallow an entire Roman army whole, leading them into a trap so massive they would never see it coming until the water turned red.